I think the conference has really met and exceeded my expectations. We've been able to bring a really wonderful group of speakers together, and the audience has been outstanding. I think there were probably 500 people at various points here at the meeting, and people seem to be really deeply engaged in the topic. What's so fascinating about this conference is that I think it goes a step beyond the normal academic conference. We seem to be at a particular point in history right now where discussions about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, what our place in the world is, how we relate to meaning, where can we derive meaning from, these questions are sort of coming back into the public consciousness now. And I think in a sense, we've gone through a dry spell. After 1900, as quantum mechanics was developed and relativity was developed, there were really rich conversations. Einstein and Bohr, and later David Bohm and others were having deep conversations about what this all meant. What did this mean? And it's not an esoteric question, because even though initially they were talking about quantum states and atoms and so forth, they were also talking about the nature of the universe and how we as individuals, as conscious beings, interact with the universe. And that began to open the door, which they realized very clearly, and they had many interesting conversations at that time. But as Einstein passed away, and then later as David Bohm passed away, those conversations seemed to mostly go underground. I don't think they stopped, but they did become less frequent and less out in the open for most people. But I think the hunger there remained, because as much as we've lived in societies throughout history where religions and when science was developed were somewhat separate enterprises, or they mixed and they interacted and they had problems, but people were able to compartmentalize their lives in some ways. Now science has moved into areas where it is talking about what the very nature of reality is. And so this has a direct impact on how people see themselves, how they see each other, how they decide to relate to each other, and so forth. And because of that, people want to begin these conversations again. But these conversations are not meaningful in today's world without bringing in a scientific approach to it and asking, what is science telling us? At the same time, we need to ask, what is philosophy telling us? What are the spiritual traditions telling us? And so by bringing these together, I think we've had a very vibrant conference. And that, to me, would be the answer as to why people were so interested in coming here. People are asking these questions, and they want to do it in a very serious and a very rigorous way. What I would say has really stood out for me was not so much any particular talk, because the talks I could praise any one of the talks. There were very many wonderful talks. What I thought was fascinating was that people came from different backgrounds and were approaching the questions from their own background. And what I found to be particularly refreshing was the willingness and the openness for the various speakers with the various different backgrounds and perspectives to not only understand, but to acknowledge and to recognize these other different points of view, and to begin to ask what these different points of view can tell us. Do they create openings? The Buddhists are quite open about saying that if science creates a contradiction for them, that they will need to then to review what they're doing. Science is always looking for inconsistencies. And I think it's very refreshing also to have philosophy in this discussion now, too. We're living in a time where, as I mentioned, these questions are back in the forefront. And I think because we're not talking about a very limited slice of the world, we're trying to talk about the nature of reality, then we're in a sense obliged to bring everything we have to bear on these different kinds of questions. And that was one of the goals of this conference, and I'm very happy with the breadth of ideas that came forward here. It was a good start. Of course, there's much more to talk about, But this was a good and refreshing start. I would say this. Much as we try to project out into the future, we, of course, begin from where we are. And for our generation and the past couple of generations, we have conceived reality very much in the scientific mold. And the scientific method has some underlying assumptions built into that method. And basically, one of the long-held assumptions is that of objectivity, third-person objectivity, where we assume that we can observe reality without interacting with it. Now, of course, quantum mechanics showed us that that was not quite true, but it's nevertheless still part of our general paradigm in how we look at the world. And our criteria for when something is real, when something is meaningful scientifically, is when we have a way to represent those phenomena, when we have a way to predict what phenomena will happen under various conditions, and ultimately we'd like, in many cases, to have ways to control that. And of course, you can't always do that, for example, in astrophysics, but in many other systems, we're seeking to be able to understand it well enough to have control objectively. So we have this assumption of an agent here and a system out here that we can control. So if we project into the future, then we've got to ask this question. If these questions of subjectivity are as important as some people think they are, then we're talking about a conception of the world in which the awareness, in which consciousness, in which the first person is much more important. You see, in a sense, in our third-person world, we're the objective world, the individual, in some sense, shrinks in importance. If we have a worldview that somehow or another recognizes an essential or critical role of the subjective, of the first person, then that in some way has to change the way that we see ourselves, that we see each other, that we see our relationship to the universe, which is critically important. And I think that may affect the way that we relate to each other, and it may affect many of our social institutions and interactions in various ways that they're really hard to see. I can't truly understand how, but the thing I would say most clearly is that projecting into the future is that if you move away from a third-person objective, strictly objective view of the universe, it's bound to change your worldview of who and what we are.